Okay, so what we're talking about today is private foundations, or something I've been wanting to talk about for some time, just because it's such a big thing. And so many people come to me in relation to private foundations. They bring me stuff, and just, it seems to be a very, is it a too good to be true kind of thing? So that's kind of the nature of private trusts. And is it something that's any good? Is it something with things like that? So I've got my PowerPoint come through. So let me just get this up now and let me get this ready to go. Okay, so is my screen coming through without much problem at the moment? Just everyone let me know. Okay, good. So people are getting it. Okay, so private foundations, everyone can see it fine, brilliant. So what I'm going to do is go through and explain a little bit about private foundations, what they are and how they work. So obviously this is about educational purposes, not financial product, not tax, asset protection advice or anything else. So before I start, who here has got private foundations? Just type a Y if you've got one right now. A few, okay. I know this is a topic that it's something that's been around. And look, anything that kind of, as I see it, it's a little bit like that cryptocurrency. The first comment I'm going to make generally about private foundation, it's a bit like that cryptocurrency that's going to give you guaranteed residual income of 10% a week for the rest of your life. I mean, it's good while it lasts, but keep in mind that generally anything that's good does require some investment and require something like that. That's the thing to always remember with private foundations first and foremost. Anything that sounds too good to be true usually is. Now, in saying that, I'm not saying there's not a use for private foundations, but we're going to go through and explain a little bit more about what they are and how they work, so to speak. So foundations. So charities and foundations have been tax exempt historically for thousands of years, so to speak. So tens of thousands or thousands of years. So it's a good reason why foundations have been tax exempt. Basically, it's always been the case for anyone who's involved in philanthropic work and making a major difference, so to speak, gets rewarded. And that's how it's basically worked. And it goes right back to thousands of years ago. In fact, if you even go and read the Holy Bible and in the book of Ezra, you'll read in there how it talks about in chapter 7, how that churches or anyone doing any kind of spiritual teaching reward is tax exempt for the rest of their life and always will be. And it's actually written in there. All throughout the English common law and just about every society, even very blatantly tyrannical societies, have always recognised the reality of foundations and charitable not-for-profit work being tax exempt. And there's a good reason for that. It's kind of like, it goes back to a universal law, which is all about the whole idea of exemptions and giving, and that someone who's philanthropic and making a difference doesn't so much need to pay taxes, whereas people who are doing anything what they're doing for pure commercial benefit, for their own personal gain, do have to make some contribution for the greater cause. So that's the best way to summarise the ethic and background behind taxation. Taxation exists because people who, by and large, are doing businesses or commercial enterprises for their own personal gain should pay some kind of contribution back to society in various taxes or higher contributions. Whereas someone who's philanthropic and giving a lot of their money away to serve and assist and support society, they no longer need to be under the same rules and regimes that apply to everyone else who's purely more about what I call commercial profit and things like that. So that's the basics behind it. So because you've basically paid your dues to society, so to speak. This is why if you even look at many of the elite who are what they're doing, like Gates, Clinton, Buffett, just about all of them do heavy, heavy philanthropic work of some kind. And just about every major high net worth person or corporation I know is generally very big on philanthropy. And what's very interesting is I've noticed that people who try and get out of paying taxes without supplementing it with philanthropy or giving back inevitably seem to end up falling foul of the tax office or something like that. So that's just my starting comments. This has been one of the secrets of great wealth. It's almost like a universal law that the more basically you give, the more you get back. In the teachings of the Kriya yogis in the Holy Bible, it says in the book of Luke that given it shall be given back to you, pressed down, shaken together, running over. My Uncle Graham, I remember, one of the most generous men I'd ever met to this day, and yet this man always had money just pouring in with him abundantly. I've noticed in my life, whenever I've been abundant with my giving of my time, of my love, of my wealth to make a difference in people's lives, I always end up getting a lot more flowing back my way. And so it is definitely a great secret. And this works for both the good, the bad, and there's an old saying, the sun shines brightly upon the just and upon the wicked. And it's really the same when it comes to this. This is universal law we're talking about here. That it doesn't matter what you do, you could be one of the worst dictators and worst tyrants, but many of the dictators, tyrants, and people like that do understand this universal law. I think Bill Gates is a classic example of someone who has a very good understanding of this law. He is a massive philanthropist and gives a lot away. It's unfortunate, but he also happens to do some stuff that's not quite so good. But he does understand this universal law, and the biggest mistake someone can make is to start thinking that universal law only applies for good people. And as most of us know, if we're honest, that just isn't necessarily true. I've met very, very kind people who've died in horrific pain from cancer. And I've met absolute arseholes who continue to be 80, 90 and live on in absolutely immaculate health. So it's really got to do with understanding universal law. There was a joke in my family even, with my mum where, she's 80 and by and large in very good health. And as my father said, and he kind of said a half joking, but he was also serious. He said, your mum will never really get majorly sick because he said she'll make sure that everyone else suffers around her long before she basically goes through any suffering herself. And we all laughed, and I think was a lot of truth in that. And we even said that to my mum, and she laughed. She goes, yeah, you're probably right on that one. So the point is, universal law is universal law. And this is a really important concept to grasp whenever you're thinking or dealing with any kind of foundational kind of stuff and the reason behind it. And one of the, of course, the traps that's happened with private foundations is that many people who've gone on that path, although they'll dress it up and say, oh, no, I want to give back and I want to do this, by and large, really, it's just a way of getting out of paying tax or avoiding giving back in various forms, which is hence why those of you who've worked with me ever to set up a foundation, and there's a few of you here I've noticed, but the first thing I talk about is that you're actually doing what you say you're going to do and that you really are going to give back. Because otherwise I know that if you don't, you are going to face universal law's backlash in some form, whether it's the government looking closely, some kind of financial, setback or whatever else. So the elite will know and use this law. It's kind of well known, well understood. I mean, as a very clear example, I've mentioned the Clintons. The Clintons do have heavy foundations, and yes, they've done some very naughty things with their foundation, but they've also, all these people, when you look into the other side, they do actually do a lot of good and a lot of contribution for change. Same with the Rockefellers, like the oil industry and the way that took off. Originally, they had a very big involvement in that, and their foundations at one stage were used to do a lot of good and improvement in technology. And then, of course, they have now been, of course, they started funding communism and other kind of stuff. And that tends to happen with these things. And Bill Gates. And Buffett, of course, gave away a lot of his money. Buffett is a particularly interesting character because he's well known for being insanely rich, and yet he really just, by and large, continues to live very similar to what he did when he was younger. Still has a very similar kind of car, similar kind of house, being married to the same woman, and by and large, just as he said, he just doesn't see the point of, doing them. And I made this comment to someone recently. I just said to them, at the end of the day, you only need so much money before you're getting into gluttony, really, unless you're giving it away and using it for a higher good. So pretty much every single elite, no matter who they are, good, bad, or whatever, do a lot of this kind of stuff. And That's why, by and large, even when you go to the tax office and get your foundations approved, there are certain clauses that you have to have in there. And one of the clauses is that you will use your money basically for the purposes of the foundation, first and foremost, and that it's not for personal gain or profit for the members. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't pay people or that members can't get looked after from the foundation, but you're making an undertaking in your deed that it is not for your personal profit or gain, so to speak. In other words, it's not the primary purpose of the foundation. I have a foundation as a church or spiritual teaching foundation, and I can say that with integrity, but that isn't. Yes, I look after myself well for my foundation, but a lot of the money is also used to do greater good and give back, as some of you have experienced what we do. So you basically have to have a lot of different things in a foundation when you go back in ancient times, go back to the understanding of how and why they were set up. And they were set up exactly for that reason. They were meant to operate outside the commercial sphere, so to speak, and allow people to be looked after and rewarded and given special treatment by the government of their day to recognise the fact that they're already doing their duty to society, their civic responsibilities, and giving back and helping the world around them. And yeah, without having to go through the normal tax of everyone else. It's very interesting because Ken Wilber and Claire Graves, in their books on the tiers or stages of consciousness, have this very interesting kind of thing, which I'll just quickly bring this up and show this to you now. But when you bring up, I'll just quickly show this whiteboard, for example. Wilber and Graves have done this consciousness modeling, which it's a fairly lengthy one, so I'll try and keep it relatively, I'll try and do a simplified version of it, how it works, but basically works something like this. So you've got tier 3 consciousness, which is very rare, very, very few, if any, individuals have got functioning at that level. And you've got tier 1, which is by far the bulk of people. Tier 1 consciousness, tier 3 is where you become what's called supermind or or higher consciousness. You're pretty much living in that all the time. So in other words, you're actually living as a yogi. That's kind of that level there. There's about 4 different levels. There's about 4 different stages within that, So there's like, and in tier 1, there's generally 8 different layers. So like, for example, and just for simplicity's purpose, 1 to 4 is more what I call, or 1 to 3 is what I call very much basic foundational, like about survival, sexual sort of pseudo stuff. Level 4 is very much about rational, black and white, so to speak. That's what I call, or what I'll probably do a fundamentalist black and white. So many COVID Nazis are very much within that, religious extremists. 5, and then what you got is basically 5 is more what's called grey area, rational, business, logic. So that kind of person is more in the corporate sphere. So generally that's where a lot of people are at now. 6 is when you start moving into a what's called social enterprise way of thinking. And then 7 to 8 is where you start thinking more in terms of, this is where you're more integrated, more thought leader sort of level, where you're more integrated personality, moving towards being a thought leader. Tier 2 is much more where you're about, there's generally a level 1, this one here, and level 2, which is more like about a holistic, teacher, thought leader, basically someone who's affecting mover and shaker, so to speak. That's somewhere around that kind of stuff there. And then you've got like the second one over here is more what I call visionary world leader kind of level. So generally, for example, a foundation, generally people who hit level 6 and above are starting to think in terms of that. So generally people 5 or below are very much more about personal gain, personal drive, personal achievement. And at level 6, you're starting to think more social enterprise. By about 7 to 8, moving into tier 1, 2, you're much more really about what's happening at that global level, so to speak, and holistically. So generally, it's very important that at the foundation level, you're starting to think in terms of the social enterprise, the giving back, the making a difference to the world, that kind of stuff. So hopefully that makes sense to everyone. But understanding this whole idea of how this actually works, this is a very important foundation to get, grasp, and understand if you're going to go this path of private trusts or any kind of trust or foundations. So McNaughton in Pemsl's case, which is considered the highest authority in this area, defined 4 types of foundations overall to summarise them. One is where you relieve poverty, mental health, distress, abject suffering, crisis counselling, anything where you're directly serving somebody who really is an immediate need. So this is not preventative, this is more immediate need, so to speak. So that's the best way to think of this category here. It's very much about, instant need to fix instant problems, so to speak. The second one is advancement of religion or spirituality. This is the one where you're actually advancing the consciousness, shaping the teachings, shaping the evolution of people's learning. Advancement of education, this is a preventative foundation. So unlike the first category, this is where you're about helping people advance in their thinking, their consciousness, but not so much in a spiritual sense, just education around health, money, or whatever else. And the fourth one is other purposes beneficial to the community. And that's anything other than the first 3. Rotary clubs, Lions clubs, just generally stuff that helps things. And there's 5 main benefits people do foundations. This is a big one, obviously, and it drives a lot of people, but tax exemption is a very important part of having a foundation. And like I said, it's a genuine reward for being someone who gives back. And someone who's willing to give back en masse does get massively rewarded with this. There's 2 types of tax exemptions in the foundation. The foundation is always going to be tax exempt by and large. I'm presuming, by the way, what's called a tax office endorsement system. But generally, the foundation is always going to be exempt. Where the issue comes in is the individuals. Individuals generally don't get individual tax relief, except for a very small limit, like generally what's called a $30,000 rebatable amount. However, there are certain exceptions, like church pastors and spiritual teachers. If they properly structure their foundation in a way where they pay their expenses in a certain way and form, they can by and large be tax-free. PBIs can to a limited degree, other foundations to a very much lesser degree. So it's just understanding the mechanics and how they work. And each foundations have different benefits. Like a PBI is by far the best foundation if you're more focused on, purchasing land, minimizing state land taxes, raising funds and donations because you can get gift deductibility. Churches are very good for the individual pastors, but they don't get the same benefits as, say, a PBI. So everything is its pro and con. Asset protection. Foundations are well known for having absolutely fabulous asset protection. In terms of a PBI, that just means a public benevolent institution. That's the relief of poverty. So when we go back to the first list of foundations, you may remember I talked about this. The relief of poverty, that's a PBI. It's also called Public Benevolent Institution, is the foundational name for one that relieves poverty. So that's the, so to speak, that one there. Asset protection is a huge feature because foundations really by and large are sacrosanct. Governments do not like to penetrate them. Family courts don't like to go near them anything. So they're legendary for asset protection. You have the power to extend your financial blessings to help others. So they are really good. That's a big, big reason. So you can kind of give back and help other people. Hang on, my computer's jamming here. Okay, yeah, got it. So you can extend your financial blessings to help other people. That's a big, big benefit of it. You get much less government regulation than you do with normal commercial structuring of any kind. And even if there is paperwork, they just tend to get left alone more. The big issue I've noticed with foundations, and keep in mind, I've got a fairly good credibility in this area only because when I used to work for the tax office for 10 years and I was a tax auditor at one stage, I also worked for 2 years as a foundation specialist, approving them and things like that. So it's one area I do know a fair bit about. And I noticed that when we were there, we were specifically told that when foundations break the law or aren't properly, meet the approval criteria, we were clearly told, don't punish them. We're not about punishing foundations doing good. We're more about just educating them to make sure they do things properly. So even if a foundation is found, as a general rule, to have broken the law in some form, like they're claiming things that they shouldn't have claimed and stuff like that, they still, a foundation that I know run by a friend of mine, they got actually looked at about their tax exemptions, and they were told that technically they really weren't entitled to it. So they were going to be disallowed for all of them, but they never went back like 3 or 4 years and, audited them back, did a back audit like they do with commercial. But on top of that, they just said to him, and if you go ahead and fix up the way you're doing things, we'll reapprove you. So foundations are a lot more kind of left alone, so to speak. And of course, as John D. Martini was telling me when he and I had a call, he had a friend, for example, who went to Nicaragua to make a big difference there to help out with education. And the government was so happy and so impressed with what he was doing that they offered to give him a whole lot of land. And he was actually given $200 million worth of land to run this youth thing that he was doing in Nicaragua. And of course, as you would notice, something in human nature warms their heart when you see someone doing good, because subconsciously people are sick of people who are always trying to get something from them. We're used to that in society. So it's a pleasant surprise when someone's just giving back to you without expecting, where they're doing it because they want to. And I've noticed that. I remember last year, I went through a period for quite a number of years where I was very focused on, commercial marketing systems and funnels, and I did okay. And I remember when COVID happened, and honestly, I was so pissed off with the whole thing. I really just wanted to give back and help people out because I could see a lot of people were struggling. So I just did it because I really just thought, well, what's going on? If we don't kind of help people anyway, this world's going to get even worse. And I noticed that since I started doing that, a lot more people got involved in what we were doing. And a lot of people said, we love the fact you willingly gave back. And I did. I gave back because I actually wanted to, because I wasn't particularly happy with what I was seeing going on in the world. So foundations have a great thing for public relations if they're coming from the right space and because you actually are really doing it. And that's why we have a rule at Global Wealth Club, for example. I don't set up a foundation for someone if I don't feel they're doing it because they actually want to give back and make a difference. As soon as I feel it's purely they just want to minimize taxes, I generally fob them off and say, yeah, look, we can't really help you because I'm just not about that. And okay, so now what's a private foundation? So you got to understand the difference between a public and a private. A public foundation is one that's been approved by the government. So under the Income Tax Assessment Act, it states that for a foundation to be income tax exempt, it has to be endorsed by the Australian Taxation Office. And that's been around since I can remember. Until 2012, that was the only thing you had to do. And you lodged an endorsement application that was generally in and out really quickly. Then, of course, in 2012, it changed. So it then had to be also approved by the Charities Commission when Tony Abbott set up the Charities Commission. So what that now means is that the government actually ticks it off and says it meets it actually meets the government requirements. Now, a public foundation, I use them myself, although I have used private foundations heavily in the past, and there are still to do that. I've gone more this path because, like I said, you can definitely get a lot more into the public arena with what you're doing when you have a public foundation that's legitimate. And I have run a private foundation before in the work we're doing. City Awakening, which is our not-for-profit spiritual teaching work, originally I had a one before that called The Fruitful Vine, and The Fruitful Vine was a private foundation, and I ran that for quite a number of years. So I've been down both paths, and they both have their pros and cons. The public one means it's been approved. A private, by contrast, is just pretty much a charitable organisation that's set up privately between two consent parties. I mean, and a lot of people do this even without realising they're doing it. My aunt for years, she used to run this wonderful organisation that was giving back to people massively across Cambodia, across Australia, doing things to help a lot of the poor. She was an amazing lady. You know, she's a missionary, and you know, she and my uncle were a bit of a hero to me. My aunt had made a massive difference in Cambodia. You know, going there after the Pol Pot regime as a missionary and actually helping the Cambodia to really, you know, and where my aunt was good was because they were very successful business people. They actually went there and established infrastructure, raised money for orphanages, set up teaching for Cambodia, and actually improved the way of life for people over there. What was interesting was a lot of my aunt's work was done through a private foundation. Now, she didn't realize she was doing it, but she was doing it that way. She'd set up a private kind of contract, a private thing, just worked it all out herself and just got out and done it. And then years later, when because she knew what I would do, she'd go, oh, maybe I should get this approved, and we would laugh about it. Whereas by contrast to her son, who ended up going the same path, he set up a fully public foundation, got it all approved by the government, and then he raised monies massively for the whole thing. And to this day, Awareness Cambodia is still a registered, public foundation that does massive good in Cambodia, sets up orphanages, sets up things to help things there and solve a lot of the way of life over in the country. So a private one is just where you by and large just do it, and it's more just a smaller kind of operation, so to speak. So private foundations do have their part to play, and that's what I want to emphasize. They do have a useful part to play. And like my aunt never really paid tax upon any of her private foundations, but she didn't really make personal profit out of it. She used her private foundation heavily to give back to Cambodia, you know, cover expenses, but she didn't really make a lot of profit. And when I ran the Fruitful Vine, I was pretty similar. I made sure expenses were covered, but I really didn't make profit out of it. So private foundations can work fairly well in those kind of situations. And, you know, they still have a form of asset protection if set up correctly. And the thing to remember too is that private foundations aren't just an Australian thing. In fact, many countries like the Seychelles and Cook Islands, they have some great private foundation systems, you know. Admittedly, they're technically public because they can get registered over there, but by and large, they really get left alone. So private foundations, like I said, do have a really great part in society, like a tremendous part in society and how it all works. So private or sense of sovereignty, that's another one too. A lot of people who set up private foundations are just pissed at governments and don't trust the Australian government. And I don't blame them. I mean, the governments have by and large proven in recent years, and especially the last 2 years, they've broken any basis anymore by which people should give them any form of trust. And I think we would all agree on that. Their behaviour has been nothing short of dictatorships and appalling. But in saying that, the one thing they've always seemed to be generally, you know, pretty good and a whole lot better is when it comes down to, to foundations, so to speak, and when it comes to charity. There's one area they've still, by and large, been fairly well behaved, even though they've tightened up their approval criteria. So one of the things with the private foundations that I've had a bit of an objection to, only because I do know these very well, because these were something that I learned a lot about many, many years ago. I was involved in underground off-the-grid movements that were doing a lot of these. And what I've noticed has happened, especially in Australia, it's the ethics of people who do a lot of these, which really pisses me off, to be completely frank. You know, they sold a dime a dozen. And all I ask people when they say to me is, I say, what support have they offered to give you if the government looks at it? And they said, oh, well, they all told me that, you know, it's my job now to work it out, and, you know, and they can't help me with that. But they said, you're sovereign and no government should do anything for you. And I said, I agree, you know, and I said, and in theory, I don't believe government should be able to run around coercing people into taking experimental medical procedures which haven't been properly authorised, and, you know, and people should have a freedom of choice of their bodies. But in practice, that's not quite what's happening, is it? So I'm saying in theory, but yes, I mean, government shouldn't be able to interfere in citizens' private affairs when it comes to their charitable giving and tell them they've got to pay taxes. But You know, do you think that if you told the mafia that they really shouldn't be coming in extorting your community and forcing people to pay you money, but they're going to listen to you and apologize? So no, they'll probably just shoot you or, take you out and pull out a few fingernails. So I said, it's just important to understand. And this is one I fell out with quite a few private foundation people, because all I said to people was, look, it's great if you're doing it, if you believe in what you're doing. Have you asked the people who set up for you what support they're going to give you? And they'd all say, oh, well, no, not really. And then they'd come back and say, oh, no, they just told me, that this is, I've just got to basically, but I'm sovereign. I said, that's great. So I said, are you aware that every single court case that's ever gone before the Australian courts on private foundations, where people have claimed that they don't personally have to pay tax, they've lost on? They said, really? I said, yeah. I said, look into it yourself. Court cases, government things. So have a look at it. And I'd say, so whoever's selling this to you, I said, that's fine, provided you're aware of that risk and you're doing it because you believe in it, you're willing to fight for what you believe in. They said, no, we want something legitimate. I'm like, well, this is what you're dealing with. Private foundations have their asset protection, but understand that every court case or whenever governments have looked at it. Now, I said, in saying that, in practice, governments very rarely look at private foundations. It's just not high on their radar. They've got plenty of other ways to get money out of people. So I said, the chances are, it's a bit like the risk of getting side effects from a vasectomy. They're very small, but people do get it. And when they do get it, they're not particularly pleasant. And that's why I chose not to get one myself. And so equally with private foundations, they're, in theory, like I said, the chances are if you get one of these, you'll never be looked at. It's very highly likely. But if you do, and it goes to court, you will lose. So it's always important to remember that and ask why you're setting this up and things like that. Because the government have set up a public foundations regime. And many times people get a pleasant surprise when they find out that everything they wanted to get, they can get through a public foundation, and they can get all the same tax benefits, and it can be legitimate, and they can sleep at night. And that was why, after running private foundations for years, and I just did it just because I wanted to show that I could do it, but eventually I realized it was a hindrance to me actually really growing serious wealth. And I've noticed that once people get interested in building serious wealth and becoming genuine philanthropists, they inevitably end up going towards the public arena. That's what I've noticed as a rule. That doesn't mean that you can't have a private foundation as well. It's just why you're doing it: protection, asset protection, or what. So they believe in the cause, and there's facts and there's drawbacks for the private foundations. And although they're great in principle, like I said, they're very hard to work in practice because governments just don't actually recognise them at all. That's half the problem. They don't recognise them. And so as long as you're aware of that, then that's going to be completely 100% okay. So the main reason you use them is because you really, truly believe in the cause. So there's a few things to know before you commit. Like I said, you're definitely not geared the same. I mean, you have to know what you're doing. I remember the ATO did actually ring me once about my private foundation in 2006 and says to me, well, you actually should be registered if you're going to claim exemptions. I said, no, I don't. I said, you got no jurisdiction over me. And I kind of said it, but I wasn't saying it angrily. I just calmly said, well, I'm just running my private foundation. I'm not making profit, which I wasn't. They said, oh, but you're meant to be registered. I said, I'm not going to be. And I said it so calmly, matter of fact. The girl goes, oh, okay. Well, anyway, just thought I should let you know. I said, okay. I said, thanks for letting me know. And I just got on with life. But most people don't have that kind of certainty. And that was because I'd done my research. I knew where things were at. I'd worked out worst case scenario. Worst case scenario was they would say, Nat, you've got to register it. And we're going to look into it to an audit. I would have said, fine, you can audit as much as you want. They wouldn't have really found I'd made much profit, and it would have been a waste of time for everyone concerned. So I kind of knew what I was doing and what I was dealing with. But most people don't. And it's a bit like not investing in something, but you really don't know what you're investing in. You just shouldn't do it. You should understand what you're investing in before you actually go ahead and do it. So as I mentioned, anyone who's ever been audited has lost, and they've not only been taxed, but there's been heavy penalties. And when I say heavy, I mean heavy, bankruptcy, everything. So that's just because when you've got the mafia running your court system, and government working on behalf of collecting for the banks, that's what's going to happen. Fact is, the reason that we've got Australian income tax is because basically when you look more into it, I don't have time to go into that in this webinar, but the income tax regime by and large exists because it coincides heavily with the rise of the Federal Reserve Bank or Federal Reserve in 1913 with a private corporation. Basically, the Australian Taxation Office are simply agents for the Reserve Bank. That's all they are, and they're the debt collectors. So generally, the banks are not going to give up their money all too easily. So the foxes may have no right to eat the chickens, but I don't think they're going to listen to you when you tell them they really shouldn't be sitting in the chicken pen, stuffing themselves with nice, fat, beautiful, juicy hens. So that's kind of how you got to see this. The other one is the tax law states very clearly in Australia, and that's why it goes to court and loses, but it must be endorsed. And like I said, the big issue comes in if you start making profit in the foundation and then using it for your personal ends. If you set up a private foundation and are just doing it to do good, help your community, you're never going to really have a problem. So let's just say that you set one up, you're not really doing it to make money for yourself, you're giving it all away. My experience is that a lot of people are doing it because they want to make money for themselves and not have to pay taxes. And that's where the problem comes in. So, like I said, you've got to go through those two stages because you're essentially saying that the government doesn't have any jurisdiction over you, and you certainly are being extremely bold, to put it mildly. So while that may be the case, that's not how the government see it in practice. You're basically saying to the government, you have no jurisdiction, come and get me if you think differently, and things like that. So, but it is your choice, you know. So we won't set it up. In fact, I'll explain this a bit more clearly. We won't set it up for our clients if they're purely doing it for, say, tax minimization and nothing else. The way we work at Global Wealth Club or encourage or educate people is to set up public foundations. If you want to use private, that's totally fine. We can guide you to people if you're using it more just purely for genuine not-for-profit. And it is a good, cheap, effective way to just do not-for-profit activities of asset protection. So let's say that you were like my aunt, you wanted to do genuine asset ways to help, you know, your community or do some kind of COVID awareness to help people find their rights and power. You really didn't care about making money out of it or not. You just were doing it to do good. You just covered expenses and nothing else. In all honesty, you're not really going to have a problem with a private foundation. You're going to run into problems if you, as I mentioned, try and do it just purely to make money and kind of use it as a tax haven. Keep in mind that the ATO are absolutely looking at anything that remotely resembles a tax haven, like anything offshore, anywhere like that. We've got some of the strictest offshore laws in the world. We've got some of the strictest tax promoter penalties almost anywhere now. In fact, tax promoter penalties are heavy for people who are just purely setting things up or doing stuff for tax avoidance. And it goes back to my tax matrix diagram, which I shared in previous webinars. It comes down to how the taxation matrix works in practice. So when you look at the taxation matrix, it has this like 80% of people who fall within that matrix, who by and large fund the remaining 20% of the elite and everyone else. So it's a little bit of an annoying glitch or situation, how the matrix works. So when you look at the tax matrix, for example, which I'm just getting it up now for you, that's by and large what I've done or came up with previously. So you've got this 1% that by and large the elite create the system and own it. You've got the 4% who control the system, don't pay taxes, they're the philanthropists. You've got the 50% who get looked after by the 5% at the top here, provided that they follow the system in every way. And then the 80% in the middle who by and large pay all the taxes, with maybe a small group over here who are gradually finding their way out of the system by learning the kind of stuff I'm sharing with you today. So that's by and large how the tax matrix works, so to speak. So it's important just to think about what we've seen happen in recent years. We've seen governments can lock down the whole world without much objection. Just imagine what they could do if they target anyone who's going against them in this environment. In other words, just purely things like that. And keep in mind that phase one, as I always thought of this pandemic, was to actually get after people's health and get people used to giving up bodily integrity and just doing whatever the government tells them, no matter how stupid it is. The government have now discovered that people will do that. That no matter how stupid it is, if it's a stupid thing like a mask, which just about anyone that's got a remote semblance of an IQ that's higher than 50 would know is not going to protect you against a, deadly virus, but nevertheless, people are just complying for the sake of complying. It's not going to be too hard for phase two just to take everyone's money off them, which is where they're looking at in this lovely little great reset, so to speak, So it's important to get that and really understand that, so to speak, and how this whole thing works. The kind of people who set up the private foundations, like I said, are those who strongly believe in their cause, are willing to stand their ground if the government comes for them. Only in that situation would you consider it. So, and as I mentioned that. So you just got to really know what you're doing and why you're doing it. So the alternatives that you really have is to do very legal solutions, so to speak, and to set yourself up with public foundations. If you're doing it for genuine giving back, making a difference, tax minimizations, then you get the benefit of tax minimization. So if you go ahead, set up a public foundation, meet the criteria, you will get the benefits of tax minimization. If you want to set up a foundation just purely for philanthropy, giving back, you don't care if you make any money or not, a private foundation is definitely something you can put on the table. So examples of public foundations you can set up, there's quite a number of them. You've got this school building and library fund, so to speak. You've got the Rotary clubs or school sports. The other one you've got as well, which I'm just writing in now because I realise I forgot to mention a very important one, is a private auxiliary foundation, it's called. So the auxiliary foundation, basically, what this does, it's a way where you just purely can invest tax-free, provided that your investments are being used to fund philanthropy. So it's a very good little thing, to fund philanthropy, so to speak. So purely to fund philanthropy, a private auxiliary. So there's quite a number of different things you can do and stuff like that. Okay, so any questions which you've got on this? Any questions? So KA, what about a trust to purely protect your assets and keep your property homes, not for tax reasons, but so we don't lose ownership? Look, a trust, a trust basically, so to speak, there's different types of trusts and things like that. So the private foundation or private trust, so to speak, I think they're by and large a dime a dozen. The foundation is purely for charitable purposes, is probably the big difference. A private trust is more for personal investment purposes and things like that. So the big difference between a foundation and trust is a trust, you can use it for just about whatever you want, really, for private wealth building purposes. A private foundation, you've got to have a philanthropic bent. That's probably the biggest difference to understand between the two. So they are separate things. So you can set up trusts, you can set up private foundations. The Seychelles and the Cook Islands have both private foundations and private trusts, and they have public foundations and public trusts. So Paul asked, what's a private auxiliary fund? I just mentioned before, it's a foundation that you set up where you can invest money in cryptos, cash or whatever, and then you can use that money and give it away for philanthropy. So the profits have to be given away. Alex, how much does it cost to make a foundation? It's a bit like asking about buying a car. Like I know people setting up private foundations who just charge a couple of grand. And like I said, they don't work for tax minimization, but work for asset protection. The kind of ones we do, you're going to be looking at anywhere, depending on the kind of foundation, from 15 grand, to 40 grand, depending exactly on what you're setting up and why. There's a huge process to get public foundations done correctly and properly, and things like that. So Yeah, look, Graham said about leaving the private foundation dormant. Yeah, look, I chose to do that myself, Graham, years ago, after having used it and I researched and looked at everything. At the end of the day, I don't really like dealing with stuff which could come back down the track. And they work when you're small. When you grow bigger, I just didn't see the point of it myself, unless I'm doing it for asset protection. So just didn't see the point. Amanda asks about a public foundation. Does it also have to make no profit? Does it make no profit? Yeah, look, the difference of a public foundation and a private, you can make profit with a public foundation, provided it's used for the purposes of the foundation. And even a private, you can do that. It doesn't mean you can't pay yourself stuff. Like if you look at churches like the Catholic Church, the Greek Orthodox Church recently purchased a $6.5 million apartment for the Archbishop, and that was fine because that was part of his package, So you can be very generous with your pastors, but by and large, the profit's got to be used for the foundation or proper commercial thing. The biggest thing that a lot of people struggle with a foundation is the whole idea that, like say with the Gates Foundation, it goes beyond their lifetime, but they're effectively giving up their right to personal wealth. The foundation, you're by and large signing a clause where you're saying that the assets of the foundation will stay there or be given to the similar things. And so I just tell people, if you're really driven by personal wealth, then you really shouldn't be using a foundation, whereas if you're happy to control the wealth, like for me, I like controlling my wealth and things like that. Wendy, do you know any examples of what West Australians have opened up private foundations or bank accounts? It's a bit like asking, do I know any examples of the West Australians have bought cars before? So yeah, there's plenty of people that do it, Wendy. I just don't know what context you're referring to. Sylvia, can I change my private into public? Not very easily, no. You probably would have to go through a whole process and start again. They're very different kind of constitutions for my thing. So how do you best suggest we protect our homes? I thought this webinar was about trust and private trust. Yeah, well, the best thing to do about protecting the home is what you should do is I'll take you to the Global Wealth Club site. We've got plenty of free trainings on that, which actually cover that really, really well. So what I'd suggest, we've got some very brief trainings that cover that very well, that everyone who's watched this like it. If you go into the education section and click on the free trainings here, and then you go down here and click on the protect your wealth and assets. What you're going to find here is there's a few different things you might find very useful. There's a lot more on charitable foundations in here, which explain about public. So if you want to watch the public foundations one, for example, they go more into it here, which is on the churches, educational, PBIs, offshore, things like that. And there's also one about protecting your home and how you can do that. So if you click on the property protection, you will see a lot more about that. And that kind of means you can watch it over and over and over and over and over again if you want to. So hopefully that answers the question. So would having a public foundation assist if we wanted to acquire debt from banks? I've absolutely zero idea what you're talking about on that one, so I can't unfortunately answer that question. Jennifer, what is the necessitous persons foundation and would it be public or private? Yeah, that's a very unusual one. I've only ever set one of them up once in my lifetime. An example of a necessitous persons foundation is, let's just say that somebody becomes a quadriplegic, or you got a leukemia child. And so you set up a special foundation that's purely to raise funds for that one person. That's a necessitous persons foundation. It's generally just it's not like for a public group, it's like for one purpose, more specific cause. If you set up a foundation in Australia but wish to use it for overseas project, is this legitimate? Yeah, it's a very good question, Suzanne. You can, but the main purpose has to be within Australia. If you want to set up a foundation purely for overseas, you've got to set up what's called an overseas aid fund, which is a whole different process altogether. Or a private foundation can work there, but you're not going to get a lot of tax benefits from it. But yeah, good question. Yeah, anonymous attendee. I don't understand the question at all. So, Suzanne, if you have different projects, do you set up trusts under the foundations or different foundations, different projects? It just depends. Like if you're doing a mental health crisis counselling, for example, and you're also running a church, they're two different foundations, you know. Me and my son are looking at setting up a foundation for youth education, and that's going to be separate from the church or anything else we're doing. So let me have a look. There's still a few more questions. When borrowing money from banks and they want to see income earnings, would the public foundation financials be more readily acceptable over private? My understanding is absolutely yes, is the answer to that. Wendy, do you know if private trusts are able to open a bank account? Oh, some banks do it. I know Westpac do it, and I've heard that CBA do it as well. There's also one which I've used in South Australia, the Lutheran's Laypersons League, that does it as well. So you can do it, but yeah, you've got to kind of look around at that kind of stuff. Okay, so any more questions on that? Hopefully that makes relative sense. Yeah, ANZ does it as well. Yep, okay. John, how do we protect our family home if the government intend to buy them back to rent under the New World Order scheme? That's a bit of a difficult question, and it's a good one. I personally don't trust them at all. That's why I don't own property myself anymore. I just chose not to in Australia. I think property is a great asset to own in a free world. In a communist regime, I don't trust it one little bit. I'd rather my wealth elsewhere. So that's my own decision. But if I did own a house and was going to protect it, I would certainly be having it either in some kind of foundation or trust, or I'd certainly be having a second mortgage over it, like in these videos I mentioned. The second mortgage would make it far more likely to be okay in some form. But yes, that is a challenging kind of question, and it's a good question. And yes, that's what I'd be doing with your home. I'd definitely be taking second mortgages, and I'd be over it and watching those property videos to find out how you can do that, and at least have it linked back to a foundation or something like that, which has a mortgage or lien over the property. So, okay, so Hendel says Westpac are closing their private. Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. I'm surprised they've done it for so long, to be frank. I really am. You know, I didn't expect them to do it for quite so long. So, yes, you can kind of link property to public foundation. Perhaps it depends on your situation. Yes, the website covers all about the free trainings. So go and have a look at the free trainings. Okay, so on that note, is there anyone who wants to, thank you for coming. If anyone wants to know any more, is anyone interested in finding out a little bit more about foundations, or, you know, possibly inquiring and setting one up, or, you know, just type a Y if it interests you. Yep, so a couple of you do. So, yep. Yep, so there's a couple of you here. That's great. Yeah, look, what I suggest that you do is go to our website, like I said, to this Global Wealth Club site. You will see here where you will be able to go down and complete a form down here, and then let us know what you're looking at doing, and we can take it from there. The last couple of questions, someone's asked about public or private. Yes, you can certainly have both if you've got the purpose for it, depending on why you're using it. As I mentioned, private can still work for asset protection. Yes, there will be a replay, probably going on YouTube channel and things like that. Okay, thanks everyone, and I'll speak to you a bit later on. Thanks for coming.